Good afternoon. As Karen rightly said, I'm the fill-in act, but I hope to make it relatively interesting. I suppose one of the things I want to talk about, following on from Stowe's talk, is really about the kind of the firm, I suppose. The firm, or the corporate limited company, is actually relatively a recent invention. It's actually a product of something like the 18th century, and it was something that was born when people were trying to exploit other parts of the world and given royal charters to exploit those other parts of the world. And in a sense, I think we're coming to the end of the firm. And I want to talk about what that, in a way, what that means and what are some of the scenarios. And actually, I want to focus on some of the challenges, because I don't think it's just all going to be nice in heaven afterwards. I think it's actually going to be quite difficult. I'm going to start with 3 stories. So these are 3 stories that I experienced, and I'm going to talk to them. They kind of, for me, cover the last century from my personal perspective. It's Detroit to Bath I'm going to go. Detroit. I was fortunate enough to spend about a week out in Detroit in 2010. And I had the fortune to go to the Model T Ford Museum, where the original Model Ts were being built. And they've got lined up all the Fords all the way up into about 20 years, about 15 years after the Model T. And as you go there, you sort of notice certain things. So everyone's heard the story about when Mr. Ford was getting all these, getting the factory started, that he effectively paid nearly, I think it was something nearly like 200% more than every other factory. Right? He paid way more than everyone else. But the question is, why was he paying way more than everyone else? And the why was that his attrition rate was something like every week he would lose between 40 to 60% of his staff every week. Right? And so he changed pricing. He changed the wage. Now, the reason was, why were people leaving? Why were people leaving? They're being asked to do the same thing over and over and over and over and over again. So this would mark the transition from people being craft to being effectively asked to do the same thing over and over again. Now, the remarkable thing is, as you move down the Model T, sort of the Ford line, about 5 to 7 years later, and a few versions of cars later, the car has become stylized. Right? It's now got, and it's got a nice poster next to it of a woman lounging next to the car. And you kind of sort of saw this transition had occurred. And one of the things that sort of occurred to me, and it's only my own personal sort of reflection, was that actually what had happened was purpose had been removed from work, and the extra cash that had been given was effectively allowing us to buy purpose, to consume purpose. So we were now going from being the producers or the makers of purpose to being the consumers of purpose. And that, to me, was a very powerful trend of how I think that sort of transition that Ford had done. And in a sense, that's story number 1. Story number 2 comes from, effectively, my experience in architecture. So since 2000, up till 2004, I was working with a very, very good practice. Nothing bad about them. I saw them go up from being 17 people to 65 people. When we were 17 people, we were designing handrails with nodules on them. And I've told this story before. And why we were designing them was because actually tactile memory is one of the last memories to go. And we were designing them for effectively a hospice. And we were looking after actually encouraging people to use their handrails to get to their rooms and various other things. So we were working at a very tactile level. When we were 64 people, this is a very good practice. There's no quality differential, honestly. Actually, we had started the partners would do drawings, and the drawings would get actually replicated out into buildings. But that ability to do tactile relational intelligence had disappeared out of the organization. And that, to me, was a product of size. The intelligence of the group, most of the people in the room were still first class, but the ability for management to occur in a relational economy had fundamentally destroyed the smartness of the product. So we'd gone from being relatively smart, really careful designers to being actually producers of sort of images. We would take an image and then carve it and replicate it out to details. And that was something about the design process that we were in, the design management methodology we were in, and something about nature of how we manage size. Well, let's try that. Okay. The third thing, architecture school. Architecture school, sort of, I was there until 1998, and something that struck me over that period, something that struck me quite profoundly was that actually everyone was talking about the knowledge economy. You know, this was the big thing. Everyone's like, well, you know, it's the knowledge economy, guys. But actually, when I looked at my life as an architect, I was producing knowledge, or information, let's say, and effectively, I was telling the bricklayer and the brickie where that wall was, what size that wall was, where those bricks came from, what the pattern of the bricks was, what the size of the mortar was, what the nature of the mortar was. When we talked about the knowledge economy, actually what I realized was actually knowledge was, and information, and craft information was being stripped and centralized amongst a few. Architects were producing and synthesizing information and stripping intelligence from actually the everyday. So in a sense, it struck me that as architects, we were part of the process of actually de-skilling and de-skilling the end line and depurposing it, right? Because once you have no choice, once you have no ability to actually make any decision about that wall, what is your relationship with that craft or piece of work? Pretty nominal. So there was a process that we've been on over the last few years, last 100 years, which has been about stripping purpose from the act of work, act of doing, and actually liberating it through consumption. And I think we're at the middle of actually turning that around. You're going to hear some wonderful speakers, and you've already heard from some wonderful speakers, who are starting, for me, to talk about this shift of how we go from a consumer-oriented to a more producer-oriented economy, and what that nature of social production really looks like. And in a sense, it, for me, talks about the kind of diseconomies of scale. Economists often talk about the economies of scale, but actually there's huge diseconomies of scale, which are under-discussed. I mean, there's some very interesting examples of how much the cost of management is in terms of actually, if you take £1 from one point and you take it all the way up and then redistribute it, actually the losses are significant. And I think what we're starting to move into is a world which is starting to question this notion of management and how it can be liberated and thought about. But this is part of a trend, right? This is, for me, part of a course, and I sort of quickly roughed this up in a sense, but it sort of talks about this transition from effectively the social state, the private economy, to the civic economy. And I use the word civic economy because I think it is citizen-led. There's a fantastic graph going around Twitter over the last literally couple of days, which some of you may have picked out, was in the EU, how few very large organizations have been born since the 1960s. You just see a remarkable decline like that. Whereas in the US, it has been growing steadily. It's been actually normal since it's been flatlined at about since 1960s, but in the EU, it's just done that. Now, that's part of a trend, and I think there's some interesting implications as a result of that. But I think this growth of the civic economy, or what I call the micromassive, I think is very important. And I think it starts to liberate, and we're starting to have to look at what the informal economy means. Yesterday, I tweeted this idea that, and it's something that we've been working on, is that if you look at reputation, I'm supposed to be helping a woman in in India. She's doing a remarkable WE school. And I've been very difficult to catch hold of because I've been traveling all over the world. And yesterday she tweeted, said, Indy, why don't you, get on with it and get in touch with me? But I thought, how powerful was that? How powerful was that conversation that she could impact and influence me over Twitter in a public conversation? And this is just the beginning. Because the informal economy is going to become slowly, what I'd call the accelerated reputation economy is going to become more significant than contracts. I think as we can actually hold each other to account in micro and fractional ways using reputation, the nature of the kind of draft legal economy will be actually start to get questioned, as we can hold each other to account in very low-cost ways. Suddenly, I don't need a complex contract to hold these other to account. She's not holding me account as a result of a contract, just word of mouth. And I find that fascinating, what it's starting to do in liberating a kind of a reputational economy of the micromassive. Then we carry on going. What does that mean? I could underwrite. Now, this would be amazing to do, right? If Stowe wanted to actually take a loan out of £100,000, right? We could all underwrite him small amounts. Now, imagine what that does in terms of social underwriting. This is just the beginning of how microorganisms, all of us, can start to aggregate in ways that hasn't been done before and redistributes power in some ways. And I think, often talked about, I think the thing I'd like to bring to bear is powered by platforms. And I think that's what I'm going to come back to, in a sense. Because I think there's a really profound and challenging question for me that I haven't been able to solve, and I'm certainly not in the mid. I don't know what the solutions look like, but there are some really good challenges in there. It's real. There's lots of great examples of it. Brooklyn Superhero Store, all the way from writers coming together to effectively help children produce books, publish them locally, all the way, and there's 8 of them around the world, 86 nations, really remarkable stuff going on, to incredible Todd Morden, which I'm sure you'll hear about more, and I'm going to not sort of talk too much about. But Rutland Telecom, right? So Rutland Telecom is an amazing act where a bunch of villagers came together and effectively bought this box. That little box you see was about, I think it was about something like £30,000. BT were unwilling to put that exchange in. They came together, paid for the exchange, and effectively built their own broadband supply. They've now got the fastest broadband in most of the UK, right? And they get 7% return. And that is a product of micro-infrastructure and how micro-infrastructure is starting to actually change this dynamic. Not everything has to be macro and huge industrial. And I'm sure, actually, if Vinay can be lured into the subject of micro-infrastructure, he'll be able to discuss hugely about it. But it's a good example, and there's many others. And there's examples all over the world. Bicyceli, which is effectively picking up bikes and repairing them and shipping them. And actually, they're repairing lost bikes, that are, lost and stolen bikes, then repairing them and putting them back out into the actually shared infrastructure in Stockholm. So these are lots of really interesting examples, building whole new supply chains, again, with Ghana as well. And I can talk hugely about them, but I'm not going to spend a lot of time. I do want to talk a little bit about the hub. It's something I've been passionate about, I've been part of for the last sort of nearly 2005 onwards. And in a sense, it's something that I think is fascinating because the hub is, as was earlier described, is like a co-working space. But for me, the really fascinating bit about it is, one, it's global, right? And it's not centralized corporate global, right? It's locally owned, but it's global. And this is what I think is kind of like the fourth horizon of globalization, right? Micro-local, highly local, but highly connected. Currently, the hub is just a movement, a global movement. Yes, there's a kind of global association, so all the hubs together own the IPR and the assets, right? So it's a kind of mutual, a global mutual. All the hubs are locally owned. Hub Westminster is a community interest company. We were fortunate enough in month 11 to break even, which was really remarkable. But it's something that we built. And the reason why I think the hub is interesting, whether the hub survives or not, and I'm not passionate about that. My point is the hub signals that actually you can build a civic globalization, a civic global, a platform. There's 31 hubs around the world with nearly 1,400 new invitations that have been pulled in. Now, imagine what you could do with that with a university, a micro-local connected university. Imagine what this is starting to prove, and that to me is fascinating right now. There's some key behaviors in this story, and I think it's important to sort of talk about micromassive. I think the idea of resources, how resources are pulled together, is huge. I think the aggregation of resources through microactors is going to be very, very important. We're currently looking at IPSs, industrial provident societies. They're remarkable vehicles that are historic vehicles from the late 19th centuries, but they're cooperative vehicles where you can do an IPO, a public IPO, and it's very easy. You can raise capital, share accounts, people can invest. All of you could invest in an IPS and get returns as well, but it's actually a cooperative, and it's a very powerful vehicle for doing 21st century activity. So there are ways that are now almost looking backwards, are giving us new forms of organizing. Now imagine you could organize the cooperative online, right? Imagine if you could invest into a cooperative online. Imagine if you could do the governance of the cooperative online. That's when it becomes huge. That's what the web is starting to do, is allowing us to take these cooperative structures and make them fractional and shareable and scalable in a way they could never have been imagined. But there are some challenges, and I want to talk about those challenges as well later. Next, I think there's a kind of pregnant question for me about the social hydra. We've recently had the debate with A4E, right, who were just recently pulled out by the advertising ombudsman for calling themselves a social outcome business. They claim they do social outcome work, fair enough. Social, in a way, is now being defined at least 5 different ways from my perspective. And why I think it's important, it can be outcome focused, it can be methodology. Are you social in your methodology? It can be governance focused in terms of how do you open your governance. It can be ownership focused, and it can be input in terms of crowdsourcing. Now, all these different things currently are thought about in different ways and actioned in different ways. But fundamentally, they're part of a different process. And they're fundamentally part of the same beast. I think social outcome is inherently linked to all these other things. So when I talked about me being actually castigated on Twitter to say, hey, where are you, Indy, about the We School? That's feedback loops that are driving this integration. So when IBM talk about social business in one aspect of it, for me, these are all converging. It's a convergence course, whether we get on there. I reckon in 10 years' time, we won't be talking about social enterprises. We'll be talking about social business, and it's the way to do business in a new way. And these things are on an integration course. And as a result of that, everyone's your client. There is no up or down. Everyone is part of that process. Everyone is part of that synthesis. And increasingly at 0.0, for example, we don't perceive the funder as your client. The funder is just one stakeholder in that process. And you start to talk about these things in quite rich ways. And it allows for a more complex, rich conversation with your partners. Now, I said something quite controversial at an RBA conference, and I want to draw on my architect's hat on this. I sort of said that, and it leads on to this from this conversation, I said architects should be liable for the buildings they design. Socially liable. I want them to be able to be sued. Why would an architect say that? That was a question I got. Why would you say that? And I said, well, look at the bright side. As soon as I'm suable, I've got to make sure I've done everything there is possible to make that building public value. So if X person can sue me, I have a legitimacy with my client, with my investors, with everyone that interacts to actually make that the best building possible in terms of social outcome. That is what we can talk about when you start to perceive, and I think it's going to require us to become genuine public value actors in terms of being able to address these things in more profound ways. So I would encourage architects to be actually suable, because if the local authority could sue me as an architect, I would have to provide legitimacy, I would have to design in a different way, I'd have to engage in a different way, not because the developer said yes or no. That would be what I would inherently have to do. What would be the end result of the buildings I produce? It's a counter-argument, right? But you could then liberate planning. You don't need planning as a regulatory system then. Why would you need it? Because I'm liable. You can start to actually, self-regulation is possible, but it requires a whole new type of actually professionalism, and professionalism in its original sense, right? In 1839, when the RBA Charter was written, it says, I am responsible, regardless whoever pays me, for the public good. That's what it actually says in the Charter. And I think that's really, really important. I've talked about that, so I'm going to just jump. I'm going to focus on some questions, actually. there's lots of things there about team capabilities and new forms of leadership, but I want to end with some questions. I've got 6 minutes, and I think the questions for me and the challenges are really where it's at. One is an example of Huffington Post and London Zoo, and I've used these examples before, but they're great. Huffington Post, which was recently sold to AOL, and the running gag is you can sell anything to AOL, but there we are. But the interesting thing was 99% of their content was produced by bloggers, free. But it was sold for something like $320 million. And at the point of sale, the owner actually had a litigation suit put against her because she had a platform and she'd sold the platform with no distribution to the other investors, which were the bloggers. Now that to me is a perfect crystal example of effectively a 20th century architecture failing to know how to deal with a 21st century platform model. So that's just step one. London Zoo. Everyone loves London Zoo, right? That's great. It's charity. It's fantastic. But how about this? I tried to leave London Zoo, and the only way to get out of London Zoo is through a pretty tacky Disneyfied shop, right, with a child. This is a charity. Why would a charity force me into a consumptive model when I'm a member and I pay their fees, but they've pushed me through a little tacky, well, it's a nice tacky shop, but it's a shop, right? To force my kid through that. Why? Because actually their trustees are bound by law to optimize the income for actually their social purpose, single purpose. They are single purpose vehicles, they are optimized by law to do that. And as soon as a consultant walks over and says, hey, you can make more money for your charitable outcomes, they pretty much have to do it in no uncertain terms. It's quite difficult. It takes strong leadership to defy those logics. But isn't that interesting for me? This idea of single-purpose vehicles, whether it's profit or a single outcome, are part of the problem. We have to talk about ecosystems and ecosystem value in a much richer, complex way. I think finance is changing, and I think it's really, really interesting. So, and you know, social impact bonds, social outcome investment, social investment, this isn't just about, and I think it's really important to realize this, that I don't think this is just philanthropy or, you know, oh God, don't we like this? I think it's actually capital starting to have to become intelligent. VCs are moving into this space, very smart VCs. I won't quote you this, but actually a very, very good VC in America basically turned around and said, we were getting 40% returns, better than any private equity or working in the social space. 40%, better than private equity. It's not because they like this, they think it's philanthropy, they think this is the way forward. This is what the future will look like. And I think capital is starting to become smarter about what it means to actually invest long and invest into the social processes. And there's lots of innovation going on in here. It's worth keeping your eye on. I think architecture will have to become more fundamentally linked to social investment if it's going to become purposeful, as will many things. Point 3, management. Management and co-venturing. Increasingly, we talk about ourselves as co-venturing organization. We actually venture into making things. Why? Because we realize that nobody knows what the future looks like. So you have to become a venturing partner with your partners. And I think that raises some really interesting challenges about what does servant leadership look like. And a lot of the role I think we try to play is servant leadership. But servant leadership, which is what platforms require, right? So you have to be quite dispassionate, you have to push from the behind, actually can be very easily destroyed. It's a fragile thing. Because all it takes is for somebody to want to take reputational gains by themselves, and servant leadership dies very quickly. So if someone wants to accrue reputational value, servant leadership diminishes and dies very, very quickly. So servant leadership is a very fragile thing, and I don't know how to deal with it right now. So you can behave like that, but it's very easily destroyed. And it's exactly what's required for the platform economy, don't get me wrong, but I think it's very fragile. And I think we should start to think about what leadership looks like in these platforms. And then finally, a story about stories. I think we've got to become much more careful about language. Everyone talks about sharing, everyone talks about all this stuff. Streetcar, I use this example, is not a sharing economy, it's a rent economy, right? And we've got to be very careful about this. And careful in language and also in the truth that we're talking to ourselves. Why do I make that differentiation? There is a big risk that over the next 10 years, we will be moved into a massive rental economy, all of us, where the assets will be held by fewer and fewer people, right? So streetcar, if streetcar is a commercially owned vehicle and it's sold and you all rent it, fractionally rent it, means that you have no assets. You're just accessing those assets. You become revenue vehicles. Whereas if you share an asset, i.e. I share an asset with Vinay and Stowe, that's different, right? Because actually we're starting to share assets. So it's generally the asset relationship is different because we are still building resilience by all of us having assets. We're going to have to be very careful about what platforms really mean and who owns these platforms. Because if you're not, we will find ourselves being actually very small, insignificant renters on these platforms with very little power. And that is a genuine risk that we face in the shift towards a platform economy. We haven't really built the 21st century governance. Platforms should be thought of more like states than they should be as corporates. I don't think we've started to imagine what these economies look like. And I don't think we've understood that if we strip away the assets from us as citizens, we'll be left very, very vulnerable to actually any shocks that emerge. That's one of the key threats for us. So there's a great movement coming on, I think, and I think some amazing stuff going on, and lots of innovation. And I talk about this from a Hub Westminster perspective, right? Hub Westminster is a CIC. I worry about its governance. I worry about actually how much influence I have. I worry about the fact that I can nudge things, right? I can influence quite a lot. The first 12 members, I purposefully put Vinay, Dougal, and a few other people into Hub Westminster. Why? Not because I agree with them. Vinay knows that. But because actually the plurality of discourse was really important, right? It wasn't about agreeing with me. Now imagine I wanted to create a platform for slowly agreeing with me, how much influence I have in that process. So platforms are incredibly powerful, but there's huge amounts of soft power buried into them that we have very little transparency about. So I'm really, really purposely conscious about how do we build these platform economies and actually what responsibility they put on us to build a whole new form of transparency and discourse in the wider world. I think I'm done. In a sense, I think the future is not a panacea. It's going to bring a hell of a lot of challenges. And I think together, we're going to have to be open to those real difficult questions about what it means for us. At least we get sucked into building our own negative future in a way, which I think the platform economy could be far worse than the corporate economy if we let it go. And I think it requires us to be quite open to those challenges. Thank you.